Hello everyone. In this video, I'd like to discuss about the stance weapon art on greatswords such as the Claymore, the Flame Birch, and the Drake Blood greatsword. The Hollow Slayer's greatsword also has the same stance weapon art. The stance weapon art is two types, the L2+R1, which is a guard breaking one, and the L2+R2, which is the forward lunge. Now, before we go into any detail about the stance weapon art, we can check the description of these weapons. Okay, when we go to the Claymore, we'll see that skill stance. While in stance, use normal attack to break a foe's guard from below, and strong attack to slash upwards with a forward lunge. Same description is for the Flame Birch. Same description is for the Drake Blood greatsword, and the same description, surprisingly, for the Lothric sword, which is a straight sword. I would tell you a little bit later why I have the straight sword included in there. So from the description, you would expect the forward lunge, i.e. the L2+R2 weapon art, to do slash damage, because it clearly says slash. The same as the straight sword version. However, from my testing, I discovered that the Lothric sword actually does thrust damage on the L2+R2 weapon art. The Claymore does standard damage, and Flame Birch does slash damage. And this is a little bit confusing to me because from the description you can't really tell that. We won't be looking at the Drake Blood greatsword because it has elemental damage and it's a little bit difficult to test. So how do we confirm this? Well, that's pretty simple. There are enemies in the game that are highly resistant to slash damage, but are very, very weak against thrust type of damage. And one enemy is the Hollow Cage soldiers in Irithyll Dungeon. So we can use those enemies to test. Now, you might be wondering, hey, what's so special about thrust damage? Why is that even important? Well, thrust damage can counter damage, and even without the Leo Ring, the physical part of the weapon can do 30% extra damage. Only on a counter though. With the Leo Ring, it can do 50% extra damage. So the extra damage could make a very big difference if you're trading. Anyway, let's test out the damage. First, we will take care of these enemies because they will cause us trouble. Okay, just note the damage that I'm doing with the Claymore. Okay. Alright, we'll come down here and there will be a couple of hollow soldiers to test. Okay, so we know that the Claymore does standard damage. Okay, so these guys are weak against thrust damage, but they're strong against slash. So they shouldn't have particularly low or high resistance to standard damage. We did 322. Now, the thrust damage on the Claymore is the R2. We know this is definitely a thrust type of damage. Okay. That did 841, and I think that was a counter because he was attacking me. So let's do it again. 647. Okay, so the R1 did 322, and the R2 did 647. Or 800 something if it was a counter. So we know that R2 gets a little bit high multiplier than R1s on weapons, but not that much. That was nearly double the damage. And if the weapon art on the Claymore does, let's say, standard damage, it will do a little bit more than the R1, but it will be less than the R2. But we know weapon arts have a high multiplier, i.e. the weapon art L2+R2 has a high multiplier than the normal R2. So if the weapon art does thrust damage, we'd expect it to be higher than the R2, which is higher than 647. But let's test it out. It does 415. 415. And you see, he was attacking me there. There was no counter damage. And surprisingly, it did less damage than the two-handed R2, which is a clear thrust. That shows that the weapon art does standard damage. And it does not actually do slash damage, as it says on the description. And I'll show you why. Because the next greatsword we are going to test is the Flame Birch. The Flame Birch we know for sure does slash damage. Why? Because if you read the weapon description, it says slash. And we know the hollow cage soldiers are highly resistant to slash damage. Okay, you can see the jailers. Note the damage from the jailers. Remember, it was 480 from the claymore, so, and 490 from the Flame Birch. So the jailers don't have a particular weakness to any type of damage. And just to have a look, so see the attack rating between the two weapons are quite similar. You can add it up yourself. There's not much difference. There's a little bit of difference, but I've reinforced the weapons so their attack rating is quite similar. Plunge attack him. Okay, so we know that the hollow cage are very resistant to slash damage, and they basically take very little damage from slash weapons. Let's test it out. Only 79 damage, even though the attack rating is very similar to the claymore. Okay, again, let's test again. Okay, and let's test the L2+R2 weapon art. Only 150 damage, showing that the L2+R2 weapon art is most likely a slash type. But you might be noticing something strange, that the L2+R2 weapon art does 150 damage, but the regular R1 does only 79. So that means the weapon art does nearly twice the damage of the regular R1, but on the claymore it did about, let's say, 40%, 40-45% extra damage from 322 to 415. I think that's about 30-40%. I don't exactly know, but it's certainly not double. So that's another interesting feature of the Flame Birch, is that the L2+R2 weapon art gets a very high multiplier. And more about that a little bit later. So I just want to test the straight sword version. And the straight sword version on the Lothric sword actually does, surprisingly, thrust damage. It doesn't do slash or standard. It does thrust. Okay, so let's test it again. Here, the hollow cages. 254. 254. Okay, let's do an R2. Didn't connect. 513. 513. Again, twice the damage as the R1. Okay, so if the weapon art does slash damage, we expect the damage to be somewhere in between the R1 and the R2. And let's have a look. No, the weapon art does more damage than the R2, clearly showing that it's got to be a thrust type of damage. And the second one hit very high damage because of counter damage. Now, just to complete the test, we will test the damage types on the Drake Blood Knight. Because the Drake Blood Knight doesn't have a particular weakness to slash or thrust or standard damage, it's a good control test. So we'll go to Archdragon Peak. There are also enemies that are opposite in this game, there are enemies that are very resistant to thrust and weak against slash damage. And those enemies are the centipede, the sewer centipedes, and you can use them to do the test, and you should get the opposite results. As they are resistant to thrust but weak against slash, while the hollow cages are resistant to slash but weak against thrust. Okay, we'll test the claymore first. The R1. Okay, he's blocking. 216 damage on the R1. And let's try the weapon art. 281. 281. Okay. Alright. Now we try the flame birch. So remember, 216 on the regular R1 and 286 on the weapon art. $199. So $199. $392. So $392. So it looks like the claymore did more damage on the R1, but significantly less damage on the weapon art. But the flame birch L2+R2 weapon art does a ton more damage. But let's go back to the L2+R1 weapon art. How about that one? 216 on R1s. 276 on the L2+R1 weapon art. Okay, that wasn't a good attack, so let's just try it out again. Okay, let's repeat that test. The L2+R1 weapon art doesn't have the hyper armor like the L2+R2 weapon art. Just be aware, it has the similar hyper armor to like a two-handed R1. Okay, 276 again. 276. Okay, now the flame birch one. 199 as we 392. Okay, so again, so the L2+R1 weapon art on the claymore does 276, and the let's see the L2+R1 damage of the flame birch. 253. $253. Okay, so there is a big discrepancy between the L2+R2 weapon art on the flame birch as compared to the L2+R2 weapon art on the claymore in terms of damage. The L2, and the same thing with the L2+R1. Okay, so the L2+R1 damage on the claymore is practically the same as the L2+R2. Give pretty much a few damage points, but the L2+R2 weapon art damage on the flame birch is very different to the L2+R1, and it does a lot more damage than the L2+R1 weapon art. That is the L2+R2 on the Flame Birch. And I'm not entirely sure whether this is intended or this is just a strange bug in the game. I don't believe it is a bug or glitch, because if it is, it would have been patched by now, since it's 2 years after the game has released. But it is very strange that the multipliers work like that. And different greatswords on the stance weapon art, they get slightly different multipliers. The Drake Blood gets a different multiplier to the Hollow Slayer, and it seems that Hollow Slayer gets a slightly different multiplier to the Claymore as well. I just found that this is really weird, that the L2+R2 weapon art on the Flame Birch hits very, very hard and does a lot more damage than the L2+R2 on the Claymore, even if the two weapon has a similar amount of attack rating. And this is important because the L2+R2 weapon art is a great trade against other heavy weapons, such as other greatswords. You can even use it to trade against ultras, because it has a lot of poise health and poise damage. So just keep that in mind, and don't underestimate the Flame Birch. It is a slightly less powerful version of the Claymore, but it does do bleed, and it does do a lot of damage on the L2+R2 weapon art. But again, don't abuse the L2+R2 weapon art, since it is parryable and it is quite slow, and it does have pretty mediocre range, which means you can be outspaced fairly easily, and there's always a possibility of getting parried. And finally, the L2+R2 weapon art on the greatsword class weapon doesn't get damage reduction like the straight sword version. The straight sword version of the L2+R2 weapon art actually gets damage reduction, as well as good hyper armor. Okay. Now, that damage reduction only occurs if you manage to trade into the attack. Okay. While it's doing the attack, you don't get damage reduction before or after it. See, after the attack. And it does have good poise damage as well. So the L2+R2 weapon art on the straight sword is a great way to trade with greatsword players. You can actually bait greatsword players into a trade. And it has very good forward momentum, therefore very good range. It's also particularly useful for roll catching. So overall, I find the straight sword version very useful against lighter weapons, something below a curved greatsword. You can even hyper armor through curved greatswords one-handed with the stance weapon art, which it does have very good poise health. See, I got damage reduction there. Normally that attack hits a lot more damage. See? And that time I didn't get the damage reduction. I just want to time it so I hit his hit. Has hit me. Okay. Anyway, you get the idea, and you guys can do your own test to verify this or disprove this. And I hope this video has been informative, and I hope you learned something new from it. Good luck with your gameplay, and thanks for the attention.